So now after your students have read these difficult texts, one being Telltale Heart, and the other being a news article about the shooter in Colorado at the Batman movie, and they've critically read them with your help and your co-teacher's help. They've been discussing the text and how different things are significant and what they say about the overall theme of the story or the overall relevance of the article. Right. You want them to be able to write about it. That's how you're eventually going to evaluate. So how do you transition students from that sort of discussion and note-taking up to trying to build an academic article or an academic essay?
Yeah, well, like I said before, I have to start from the beginning on everything because I can't assume that any of my students have proficiency in any skill set because I don't know. They're coming from everywhere. So I really will start from the very beginning. One thing is that while we're doing all of this discussion and we're also doing vocabulary building too and making sure that we're unpacking vocabulary for multiple meanings and things like that, what I'll do is make sure that in our discussion, if I asked a why and they had an answer, I wouldn't let them tell me an answer unless they had a character witness. That's what I called it. And that means that they had to be able to cite some line with their finger on it, like for their hand to be up, their finger had to be on the line for me to acknowledge them.
You would not call on someone unless their finger was on a piece of...
Right. So even if their answer was wrong, they had to tell me their opinion and then say something immediately from the text to support their opinion, which is in the standard.
So it sounds like you've been laying the foundation,
yes,
the bricks, if you will, in order to be able to do this later on.
Right. And so they would say, well, Ms. Smith, I think he has some type of actual disease because here he says the disease had not made me, I think it's made me worse, but it had heightened my senses, not dulled them. I can quote Poe. So they would say, I said, okay, so maybe he has a disease. And they would start giving me evidence like, well, Ms. Smith, I think it's schizophrenia. I know what schizophrenia is. Why? Because he hears voices.
Right. And he's got to have his finger
right, and he has to have his finger on it. So what would happen is I would take that, and once we transitioned to writing, I would start explaining about how do you cite evidence using quotations, summarizing it, or paraphrasing it, all three of them.
And you do some direct instruction?
Yes.
On paraphrasing?
Right.
And summarizing?
Right.
And quoting?
Right. So I would actually use somebody's example, anybody in the class, it didn't matter what the example was, and if I said, if I wanted to say this to someone else, how do you quote it? And I would give them something that looked like this, a chart, and if it was a quote, we would take the direct text, and if it was a summary, we would do that, and then if it was a paraphrase, we would do that together.
So you're practicing as a class.
Right, we'll practice as a class. And then once it was time to write, I would do the breakdown for writing, and that's the hamburger paragraph.
It's classic.
It is. It works.
It's an oldie but a goodie.
Yes, and my top bun always has sesame seeds. It's great. And so I would go through the process of what that looks like with them, and I normally draw it for them, and I let them put bacon and whatever they want on their hamburger. And then we talk about...
Unless they're Jewish.
Oh, they're Jewish.
Sorry.
But they can put bacon. If they want bacon, let bacon be had for all. So we would go through that writing process, and to make sure that it was to make sure that they understood how to express their ideas.
Just summarize for us, maybe if people haven't heard, what the hamburger method is.
The hamburger method is that I would ask students randomly, what is your process of creating a hamburger, assuming everything is already cooked, because then I don't want to get into all that. And then they would say, I want a bun. I said, you're going to put the bun in your hand or on the table? And they were like, no, that's nasty. So then they would say, well, I get a plate, and then my bottom bun, and we would build the hamburger from the bottom up. And what I would tell them is that each part of the hamburger represents something in their paragraph writing, and that the plate is their brainstorming. They had to brainstorm their ideas first to get them in order to be a foundation for what they were going to put their hamburger on. See what I did there?
Yeah.
Foundation and plate.
The bricks.
Yes. So the two buns would be the topic sentence and the concluding sentence. The topic sentence is bigger because it normally has a little bit more information than the concluding sentence. And then I would tell them that the only thing they need to have a hamburger is meat. That's it. So everything else, I say, why do you even put it on there? It makes it taste better, Miss Smith. Exactly. And those are details and how and examples and explanations and imagery. And so we would go through all of that.
And sometimes if you get too much of that on there, it's just a big mess.
Yeah, and then it
just
falls
off,
over, and then you're biting into it,
silly.
and so you never want to have too much or too little. It has to be just right.
Exactly.
3 bears. So we would go through this together, and I would ask them a simple question. Maybe how do the Colorado shooter from The Dark Knight, what might he have in common with the narrator? And they could come up with different things. Some people may say mindset, some people may say they both did something heinous, or because that's one of their vocabulary words. And it's just a process to make sure that they're writing. And then I give them 2 different things to do because the writing tends to build. I have them write a police report for the aftermath of the Telltale Heart, as if you were one of the detectives who came to the house.
And our police report isn't just what happened, but it might include what do you think were the motives?
Right.
Or
what did you see? So they can use the imagery that they saw and then create a picture and then write that down as fact. So ultimately what we're getting to is, because I introduce argument and not persuasion, because we're moving in Common Core to argument, and we discuss argument, and I ask them to decide, does art imitate life or does life imitate art? And there's no right answer, and I want to make sure of that because I want them to give their best opinions that are supported by evidence from the text. So they can use the article or the Telltale Heart to support whether or not they think art imitates life.
So when they're writing this essay, with the shooter and with the character, they have to look at the story and determine what were their motivations.
Right.
Was the shooter motivated by the movies he was watching, or was he innately just a terribly evil person?
Right.
Was he imitating the art? And in Poe, was that imitating things happening in real life from his life experience that they've read about through the background?
Right, and I even had a student say, well, Miss Smith, we could say, it's hard to say life imitate art because Poe wrote all of this stuff and he never did any of it. He was gambling.
Okay.
Right. So that is a great point, because she can pull from anything. They can go research, which we do take them to research a little bit more detail about Edgar Allan Poe than what's already in the textbook, and it presents a case for her to make that just because you're writing about it or just because you have expressed it in your art doesn't mean it's happened, and it really becomes something interesting to see what they come up with.
You've developed a contextual world for them to pull from.
Right.
In our last section, I want to briefly just ask you about how the student work came out and what some of your observations were.
Well,
and we'll do that in our next section.
Okay.